from the beginning, since Riyadh really seriously, I mean, since it was talking about 17.6 gigawatts of nuclear, it has been having these on and off talks with Washington over a 123 agreement. Historically, these 123 agreements have not included anything about requiring the counterparties to forswear, to promise not to develop domestic uranium enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. That was basically new, but it was thought of as fairly innovative when the Bush administration negotiated that with Abu Dhabi for the UAE, which was finalized and went into effect, I think, in 2009. And that sort of helped get that through Congress. Then it was sort of touted as the gold standard of 123 agreements.
A warm welcome back to Decouple. Today I'm joined by returning guest Phil Chaffee. Phil has made several appearances here. We have talked about a Westinghouse of pain. We had a great episode on Westinghouse and KEPCO and the saga over the technology in the APR 1400. Phil, we've had you on for a few other topics, but I'm blanking on those right now. You are the editor. I always lose track of your exact title at Energy Intelligence, sir. I'm going to throw it over to you for a second,
Sure.
Phil. Who are you? What are you here to do?
I have for several years been the editor of Nuclear Intelligence Weekly, which is a newsletter at Energy Intelligence. I'm also now the editor of Low Carbon Energy. So we have other coverage beyond just nuclear. It's again global stuff. And yeah, so 2 titles, basically. I am based in London now. I was in New York last time we chatted. I've moved back to London. I've sort of ping-ponged between those my whole professional career. And yeah, I cover more out as an editor than a journalist these days, although I try to get out and about and still talk to people, because otherwise you're a bad editor.
Well, yeah, I do hope to, it's always a highlight being at various nuclear conferences and seeing you around. And you have had some great interviews. You asked some very candid questions, not to, blow too much smoke up your behind. But I like your work, Phil, and I do appreciate you coming on Decouple. And I think we've got some exciting stuff to talk about today. So this episode is I think coming about because of Mohammed bin Salman's, MBS's recent visit to Washington, and a lot of talk going on right now about what the future of U.S.-Saudi nuclear cooperation looks like. I think something that's significant is the U.S. likes to sign these 123 nuclear agreements with really, really strict limitations, or frankly, asking countries to, I love the word, forswear enrichment or reprocessing, even though if you sign the non-proliferation treaty, you're supposed to be able to sort of have access to the full fuel cycle. The U.S. often sort of imposes that in these agreements. And it looks like that particular part of the position the U.S. has taken historically with regards to new countries coming on may be waived for Saudi Arabia. Maybe this is setting a new precedent. I thought that was interesting. And I think there's also other stuff building off of our previous referenced episode, the Westinghouse of pain for Korea, looking at some, I guess, I'm not sure if they're rumors or if it's out there officially, that the U.S. is maybe leaning on Korea to not bid in the APR 1400 technology into Saudi Arabia, but rather act as EPC to get Westinghouse AP1000s built in Saudi Arabia. So that's sort of generally what I want to talk about. We're taking our focus over to the Middle East and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia today, Phil. So hope that works for you.
It does indeed. I've been covering it for well over a decade, so lots of thoughts.
Awesome. I mean, I guess if you have been covering for a decade, let's maybe talk a bit about why the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is interested in nuclear and what that sort of looked like over the last decade or even longer if you want to stretch back.
Yeah, so I'd have to go back to when they first came out with that target, but they have had ups and downs in their program, and if you go back 12 years ago, it might be even a bit before then, they had a huge nuclear target. They were talking about, I think, 17.6 gigawatts of nuclear coming from nowhere, basically. This is just after the UAE had launched their program. They were starting to get their reactors under construction. They have these 4 large reactors from South Korea. and Riyadh came in and launched this King Abdullah Center for Atomic and Renewable Energy, KEPCO, and then came out with these huge, huge goals. On top of that, they said they had sort of 3 pillars to their program. They also wanted to sort of investigate advanced reactors and SMRs. They had a big tie-up with KERI, the South Korean research sort of RNA establishment, and they had a big tie-up with the Chinese for fast reactor development. And then they said they wanted to do a fuel cycle program, uranium exploration, potentially enrichment, all of that stuff. None of that has actually happened. They retracted. Well, I don't know if they formally retracted, but they stopped talking about that 17.6 gigawatt target. Then, maybe 8 years ago, they came out with this RFI just for 2 large reactors. And that has sort of been what they've been teasing for the past nearly decade. All of this is very different. If you look at what the UAE did, go back to the mid-aughts or the late aughts, actually. They came out with this nuclear white paper in 2008. They had buy-in from the very top of the emirate in Abu Dhabi. And from the very top down, they said, we are going to go as fast as possible on this. They had the white paper. They signed the 123 agreement with the U.S. We can get into that because that's very important as to what then set the stage for the Saudis. But then they also held a very, very rigorous assessment of the large reactor designs on the market, and they selected the Koreans. There were other things that went into that selection process. And this all happened. And then they also launched their regulator, FANR, and spent a lot of money pulling in the top regulators from the Finnish regulator, from the IAEA, just all the sort of top talent. They pulled it in and they just floored it. And that has never happened in Saudi Arabia. What they have spent the past 15 years doing is building out optionality, basically.
And one reactor. I was just checking to see if it's actually
a small
online,
research reactor, yeah, from Argentina.
Those Argentinians. I was in Australia, and they have the Opal reactor, which is a really state-of-the-art sort of pool-type isotope medical research reactor. And I'm not sure what the Saudi one looks like, but that is, after this decade plus of big ambitions, that's what we have so far is one pool-type research reactor, which I think they brought the fuel over recently for. I'm not sure if it's gone critical.
Right. So basically, they've talked very big, but there has not actually been much movement. There are a lot of people in the Saudi program. So there is, if and when they say, yes, we are going to go forward, they could presumably move very fast. And I think that's what's intoxicating about Saudi Arabia to the entire nuclear industry. Because the second they say green light, they can move very fast. They don't really have to spend years trying to think about how to finance this. They can just sort of, just like Abu Dhabi said, go, it'll get paid for. Let's just build this stuff.
It's sort of like on the civilian side, it's a kind of nuclear breakout capacity that people are trained. Indeed, I've met and befriended some Saudi nuclear engineers trained here in Ontario. So it's definitely a thing. I mean, it is fascinating what you're describing, and sometimes it's sort of these like accidents of history or timing. That the UAE went so gangbusters on this, and that Saudi Arabia had more ambitious plans, but ultimately was held back. I was kind of looking at the timelines, and I think this, Saudi Arabia goes big. The King Abdullah City for Atomic and Renewable Energy. I mean, I guess it's like a technology campus, but it sounds like they're physically building a whole new city in the desert. I'm not sure if that's the truth or not.
I don't think it's quite a NEOM scale city, but yeah.
It's right. It's not the line or something campus, like that.
And you're right, it's city, not center, which I'd erroneously said.
Yeah. Anyway, in 2010, and then I'm thinking, okay, well then Fukushima happens. Is that what kills it? It sounds like it may be more the fracking boom could have killed it, because the price of oil was sky high. What are you going to do with all those petrodollars? Hey, let's buy some nukes and maybe stop burning so much oil to generate electricity and desalinate water. I was just looking this up. Saudi Arabia contributes about 11 million barrels per day and burns. It depends on how hot it is and how much aircon's running and how much water they need to desalinate. But something like a million barrels of oil per day. It's 1% of the world's daily oil production is burned to make electricity in Saudi Arabia. So you can see there's some kind of reasons why they might want to do something different. But
Yeah, they have also had this incredible. I mean, they're sort of one of the world leading scale ups of solar and of
yeah,
renewables, and they have. I think their targets are. I mean, there's not a really firm target, but just for 2030, 100 to 300 gigawatts of solar.
yeah,
They can get the cheapest Chinese supply chain in there, build it out. They're also building out batteries. They're sort of going gangbusters on everything.
yeah,
Um, I know you're skeptical of green hydrogen, but they have these two huge Niam and Yanbu green hydrogen facilities that they're building out. So they're doing a lot of other stuff.
yeah.
And I cannot speak to their motivations, why they have never really pressed the green light for nuclear. But yeah, they're doing a lot.
I mean, one thing I'll say is interesting is, it's absolutely easier to, build massive solar farms in massive deserts with incredible solar insulation and resources, and then back it up with gas. Because Saudi Arabia is not a big LNG exporter. They have a lot of associated gas they produce alongside their oil. I understand they're converting a lot of their oil-fired power generation, repowering to use some of that gas.
Mm.
And gas plus solar in that environment is a pretty intoxicating mix. And
And it can be a very cheap mix. Yeah.
just thinking about everything that goes into a nuclear program, it's a lot simpler to just bang up millions of panels in a desert and burn some gas. So interesting in terms, again, of sort of motivations and I guess some explanatory variables as to why things haven't moved quite the way that was maybe forecast. It's not the first time that a country's had grand ambitions and fallen short of them. So I guess what's happened more recently, or I mean, there is a sustained interest. Clearly, there's agreements been signed with Russia, China, Korea, and maybe we're on the verge of something with the U.S. Update us a little bit.
But yeah, so we'll see. So going back 2017, they come out with this request for information, and they get responses from five big vendors. So Rosatom, the Russians, CNNC, the Chinese, KEPCO, the one of the two big Korean state-owned companies, EDF in France, and then Westinghouse. Um, as this process carries forward, several years ago, Westinghouse was less in the process. They didn't respond to some of the requests for further information. So we have this process where the formal process is actually not with the Americans. It is the other four. Um, that is, from Washington's perspective, both under the Trump administration and the Biden administration, neither of them were wild about the idea of the Chinese or the Russians winning a contract like this.
Right.
Um, One of the issues with supplying a nuclear plant, a large nuclear plant, at this point, you are talking about launching a 60 to 80 to 100-year relationship, bilateral relationship. And obviously, Washington does not want to see Beijing or Moscow have that type of relationship with Riyadh. So that is sort of the context for potentially what is happening now. Uh, we had the visit of the Crown Prince to Washington 2 weeks ago now, a week and a half ago. And we had a uh, they signed basically the 123 agreement, which is all about the non-proliferation standards and just sort of setting up the legal infrastructure between the two countries. They signed an agreement, or they signed something saying that the talks for a 123 agreement had been concluded. They did not actually sign a 123 agreement. So what is there? Why did they not sign it? What has actually been agreed and what hasn't been agreed? And what, if any, commercial deal is in the works? It's not clear. If there were sort of disparate statements from the Saudi Energy Ministry and the US Department of Energy and the White House, and how they characterized what this meant commercially, whether the US is sort of now in some sort of exclusive talks over a commercial deal with Saudi Arabia, or if the US is sort of just in the running to compete with the other four vendors. And so, as with many of the statements that have come out under the Trump administration, it's very hard to say what is real, what is actually being referred to.
I guess I'm trying to get my head around historically, Saudi-U.S. relations. I mean, this goes way, way back, right, to when the OPEC crisis happened, the price of oil skyrocketed, security kind of guarantees, and the U.S. basically becoming Saudi Arabia's sort of protection, selling it, high-end military equipment, jets, missiles, that sort of stuff. The famous closeness of the Bush family, Bandar Bush, I believe. I can't remember the kind of Saudi official who was almost sort of seen as part of the family. There's been a tight relationship. There's also been tension. I understand, the Saudis didn't love the fact that the price of oil cratered with the U.S. fracking boom, and there may have been some price manipulation to try and make U.S. shale less economic to produce. There's been tensions back and forth. The idea of the Saudis going with the Russians or the Chinese on nuclear, would that be a major affront to this enduring long-term relationship that's, had its ups and downs and hiccups? Like, how significant would that be as a sort of break, or kind of threaten their tight diplomatic relationship?
I mean, I think it'd be pretty significant. It's, selling the Chinese oil cargoes is one thing, but I would actually take that relationship back to FDR meeting King
Yeah.
Abdulaziz in 1945, right? 80 years ago. There has been this sort of foundational relationship between the founder of Saudi Arabia and the US. And, sort of Saudi Arabia is one of the key linchpins of the Middle East and of the global, sort of the petro global order of sort of US protection and Saudi oil and sort of Middle Eastern oil. So yes, it's a very key relationship. I think y- Riyadh is a much more powerful player than it was 10, 20, certainly 80 years ago. And from its perspective, it probably makes sense to sort of diversify its alliances a bit. But I think from Washington's perspective, it would it would be pretty explosive if the Saudis signed a deal with, particularly with the Chinese, I mean, or the Russians.
So it seems to me that there's sort of two sticking points. One is, the U.S. hasn't been very credible in terms of delivering, its novel nuclear technology, the AP1000, domestically. The first builds in China also struggled. The Chinese have now shown that the technology is buildable and can be built quickly. And then the other sticking point seems to be this issue of Saudi Arabia very clearly saying, listen, we have our own uranium reserves. We want to mine those. We want to make yellow cake. We want to enrich it. We want our NPT, our non-proliferation treaty rights to be able to control our own fuel cycle. Maybe we should work through sort of each of those issues. And this would also be a tie-in, obviously, to what I mentioned in the introduction. I think I did, with the U.S. sort of leaning a little bit on the Koreans to say, hey, could you not bid in the APR 1400, your own reactor design that Westinghouse has some intellectual property rights to, and just work as the EPC to help us successfully deliver the AP1000s that we can't really build, but maybe with your help as EPC, we could overcome that. So sorry, a typical decouple mishmash of a question there.
You just threw a lot of stuff out there.
whatever you remember, just try and riff off of that.
Gosh, let me start with which I think was in the beginning of this question.
Who knows?
Yes, on sort of the Saudi goals, I said like the fuel cycle stuff has, I think almost from the beginning, they have emphasized that they are very interested if they are going to build out a big nuclear program. They also want to build out they want the full chain. They want the nuclear fuel. They want all of that. And I don't think there's a lot of commercial logic there if they're only building 2 reactors. But if they are building 2, I mean, yeah.
Like, really, right.
But if they are building 2 reactors with an eye to building 20 reactors, then thinking about that now certainly makes a lot of sense.
We interrupt your regular programming for an appeal from our sponsors. That means you, hopefully. Decouple runs on a strange fuel mix. World-class guest experts and a talented editorial and production team. One of these is not free. If you want more long-form, numerate, and historically informed exploration of nuclear energy, geopolitics, and climate change, you can help in a few very concrete ways. Upgrade to a paid subscription. Join us on Substack and think of this as buying a small equity stake in independent nuclear journalism. You can also make a tax-deductible donation on our website through our fiscal sponsor. You can find the button again on our Substack site. If you are a utility, a vendor, fund manager, or policy type who reads this work, support it like you would any other research product. If Decouple informs your decisions, help fund the next episode that saves you from a bad one. If you value having at least one outlet that treats nuclear as an engineering and industrial project, not as vibes-based asset class, please consider paying for it. Financial independence is what guarantees editorial independence, and it is what makes Decouple so special. Thanks again for listening to this message. Now back to the regular programming. That is a big if in that context of, wanting to get to 50% solar, repowering a lot of oil-fired stations and desal stations with gas.
Right.
Like, they don't really need the nuclear. They don't really need 20 gigawatts of nuclear, and they could probably do it a lot cheaper with solar and gas. Like, let's be honest.
Yes, that is true.
Okay.
But, also they want to move to a very high-tech economy. And if they see nuclear as potentially one of the key energies of the future, you could see how they would want to sort of do what the Emiratis are doing and put themselves as in the driver's seat there. So that does make sense. I think you were also right to highlight their view of the MPT. Article 4 talks about the inalienable right of signatories regarding the production and use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes, and they don't want to sign away that right. There, this is where it gets delicate, but there is then lots of states don't want to sign away that right, and lots of states also potentially want optionality for at some point in the future, if the geopolitics and changes, having the option of developing out a nuclear bomb. I don't think that's anything the Saudis want to do right now, but their big regional rival is Iran, right? And
Right.
there's also Israel over there with its nuclear weapons. So it's not crazy for them to want to maintain optionality and maintain their Article 4 rights. So that tackled the first part of your very long question. I think I want to briefly talk about sort of how the U.S. has reacted to that before we get to the Westinghouse Korea stuff.
Yeah.
From the beginning, since Riyadh really seriously, since it was talking about 17.6 gigawatts of nuclear, it has been having these on and off talks with Washington over a 123 agreement. Historically, 123 agreements have not included an obligation for the counterparty country. And they're 123 agreements, which is specifically for U.S. nuclear cooperation agreements off of Article 123 of the 1954 Atomic Energy Act. Historically, these 123 agreements have not included anything about or requiring the counterparties to forswear, to promise not to develop domestic uranium enrichment and reprocessing capabilities. That was basically new, and probably, I might be missing something, but it was thought of as fairly innovative when the Bush administration negotiated that with Abu Dhabi for the UAE 123 agreement, which was finalized and went into effect, I think, in 2009. After that, and that sort of helped get that through Congress, which has the option of killing these 123 agreements. Then it was sort of touted as the gold standard of 123 agreements. Yeah. It's that gold standard that has been very difficult in the negotiations between Washington and Riyadh over a 123 agreement. Incidentally, it was also, I don't think there's super active negotiations right now. Washington and Jordan had the same issue, or Amman, I should say, where Jordan didn't want to give up, sign the gold standard and give up its Article 4 rights. So it's not unique to Saudi Arabia. And it's also fair to say that the U.S. has signed other 123 agreements such as with Singapore,
And
in
Korea.
very recent memory, without a gold standard. So,
Okay.
so it's
Singapore
not,
does not have a gold standard.
as far as I know, no, it does not.
Interesting. Okay, but Korea also gave up the right to enrich and reprocess, I believe, right?
So what Korea has is it does not have a gold standard in its 123 agreement, which it wants to renegotiate. What most of the 123 agreements do have is U.S. gets prior consent if you want to do any program with U.S. nuclear material. So either with fuel that came from the U.S. or with spent fuel that was burnt in U.S. reactors or anything like that. And basically, Korea, so it does not have, it's never said we are not going to pursue enrichment and reprocessing, but it has agreed to that sort of its interpretation of its 123 agreement. Basically, it is not going to pursue these things unless Washington signs off on it. And that is actually a live issue right now because the Korean government has said we want an enrichment program. They also want to have some sort of commercial scale pyroprocessing, a form of reprocessing, and they are renegotiating that with Washington, and Trump sort of seems up for that.
If they'll buy some nuclear submarines or something.
Right, and also some sort of Korean version of AUKUS, where it's still very unclear where the nuclear material comes from, who's manufacturing the subs. There's a lot unknown. It's one of these big Trump announcements where what is actually concluded is very ambiguous.
The deal is opaque. But
So
it may be called caucus.
so going back to Saudi Arabia, then this has been one of the big holdups. The other holdup is, and sort of as sort of has been mooted as well. If you're not going to have the gold standard, what about the additional protocol, which is agreement with the IAEA? Most IAEA countries have a comprehensive safeguards agreement, which allows in IAEA inspectors. They are limited under a CSA to specific facilities, and also to giving lots of heads up if they are going to go inspect those facilities. After the initial Gulf War in 1991, when inspectors came into Iraq and realized actually they had built out a whole lot of infrastructure in the 1980s, of nuclear infrastructure, sort of under the noses of the IAEA, there was this huge diplomatic push to add this to make this additional protocol, which then, once that is signed and ratified by a member state to the IAEA, then IAEA inspectors basically can go into facilities all over the country at very short notice. So it's a huge step up into how effective the IAEA can be, and it's much harder to develop a secretive nuclear program when the IAEA when there's an additional protocol in place and the IAEA can come in. This is a key part of the Iran nuclear deal, the 2015 Iran nuclear deal. One of the final parts of that, even though a lot of the sort of ad hoc infrastructure would have fallen away after 10 years, but Iran would have ratified its additional protocol, and sort of forever after, agency inspectors would have been able to go in all over Iran. That is not in effect right now, which Saudi Arabia is very aware of. But basically, that was another ask potentially for that Washington was eager to see Riyadh do. So now we have the Crown Prince come to Washington, and they come up with this announcement about a deal. They've concluded negotiations on a 123. Very ambiguous language around the gold standard. It sounds like from what Chris Wright told Fox News, there was one interview where he was asked very specifically a couple times about this. And my interpretation of that is he was saying there is no gold standard. This is not a deal about enrichment. It's hard. Did you see this Fox News clip? It's hard to precisely say what it was. And then the DOE, the US DOE statement about it talked about, together with bilateral safeguards agreements We want to grow our partnership with Saudi Arabia, bring American nuclear technology to Saudi Arabia, and keep a firm commitment to nonproliferation. The key part there is bilateral safeguards agreements. That is different than IAEA inspectors. What bilateral safeguards agreements mean, and there are other examples of this, which we can get into if you want, is potentially, if there's a Saudi nuclear fuel facility, US inspectors from the DOE, probably NNSA or something, or who knows, could then go on a bilateral basis and go inspect those facilities. That is very different from agency inspectors from Vienna coming in. And who knows exactly what this means in terms of what the final deal might be. But the question is, if they sign a final 123 agreement without the gold standard, and possibly without Saudi Arabia also signing the additional protocol, what then happens on Capitol Hill, where Congress, which has been, it's obviously both houses are controlled by the Republicans. It's been fairly quiescent to Trump policies, but there's a lot of Republicans who have historically um, followed this issue very closely. So what's not clear is, could the Trump administration, if it is trying to sign a 123 without a gold standard, could that get through Congress? This may not have answered your question at all, but
No, I mean, it answered half of it, and I unfairly asked you like 3 questions in one in the typical decouple bundle. But before we get to that second part about whether the U.S. can credibly say we're going to build things well in your country, I just wanted to follow up a little bit more on this issue and maybe kind of try to summarize it. So in the ideal world, the U.S. would love for Saudi Arabia to sign what we call this gold standard 123 agreement, where they forswear forever to enrich or reprocess nuclear fuel, and there's the least chance of nuclear weapons proliferation in a highly charged region of the world, where Israel, everybody knows they have bombs, but they're ambiguous about it, where Iran is kind of really in a breakout position with, 400 kilograms of 60% enriched uranium. And in a situation where MBS has said, listen, we don't want to acquire a nuclear bomb, but this is a quote, without a doubt, if Iran develops one, we will follow suit as soon as possible. Given the sort of politics within the U.S., I am curious, and this needing, I'm not sure if it has to pass the Senate or Congress. You mentioned these 123 agreements have to be approved by some other branch of the U.S. government. Does Israel or the Israeli lobby within the U.S. have a strong opinion here in terms of what kind of agreement should be signed? Is that part of why the UAE agreement, which forswore and kind of reduced the proliferation risks, was more palatable? Do you have any comment here, or you can also just say no? You can also do the whole no comment thing. But I will judge you slightly.
What I will say is, it's not my reporting, because very high up, I've done enough reporting that I didn't know a lot of this reporting was real. But very high up, under the Biden administration, before October 7th, 2023, there was a lot of negotiation on what might have been a 3-way deal, where Saudi Arabia and Israel normalize relations, possibly something happens on the Palestine issue, and the US gives a security guarantee to Saudi Arabia and signs some sort of big nuclear deal for US, presumably a 123 agreement too, with US reactors and potentially US enrichment technology going to Saudi Arabia. And so this would have been this huge tripartite deal to bring peace to the Middle East, to bring nuclear energy to Saudi Arabia, and some sort of fuel cycle to Saudi Arabia, with presumably some sort of, I don't know if that would have included bilateral safeguards as well. So that's reporting that, this was happening
Right
at the White House level. I do not have sources way up there, generally, and then also with the Crown Prince, and also with Netanyahu. So it was very, very high level stuff. Obviously, a lot of that collapsed after October 7th. I have no idea if anything like that is in the works, but I think part of the logic of that was Israel being on board for a US-Saudi cooperation and for building up nuclear infrastructure in Saudi Arabia, which Israel would be generally nervous about. And certainly, if you'd asked probably 10 years ago, I imagine Israel would not love that idea. Now, I don't know. I mean, Middle Eastern politics are shifting a lot at the moment, so it's very hard to know what direction that might go. And I bring no particular expertise to the influence of the Israel lobby and the US in Washington.
Yeah, but I do think that was a quite fulsome, historically informed answer. So I do appreciate that. So let's. I think we've done a pretty decent job of framing this kind of enrichment sticking point, and the news cycle will continue to churn, and we'll see, I guess, what happens out of this Crown visit, and what comes of that. Moving on to this question of just the credibility of the U.S. Offering reactors to be built in other countries. If I'm country X and I'm looking at, doing a request for information and deciding on which technology to build, I can look to the Russians and, sanctions are biting and, they're having some real, I think 25% of their economy is now a war economy or something like that. Like it's hard. It's been really quite astounding that they've continued to, I think, deliver mostly on their schedule and commitments to multiple international large nuclear projects around the world. I think there's been some sticking points in Turkey and things like that. But I am seeing reactor pressure vessels getting delivered to Egypt, for instance. Not aware of any major delays, but you do have. With Michael Seeley, we did describe this model of go to the car dealership and Rosatom, gives you the keys, gives you the vehicle, maybe even says, hey, we're gonna give you maintenance and maybe we'll just lease it to you, whatever kind of allegory we want to make. And there's a track record there of delivering these plants pretty reliably, pretty much on schedule. And again, the AP1000s in China, the initial 4 were quite slow. Certainly, Poland is well down the path of certainly planning. I think the deployment of 3 AP1000s. But in any case, if you're looking at what country to credibly buy from, you probably don't want to buy from the Europeans right now on one extreme. So let's put America in the middle and then put, the Chinese and Russians and the Koreans in a camp, which, can probably credibly deliver your reactors. This all, again, depends on how it's framed, who takes on the construction risk, whatever else, how badly you need the power, how quickly you need it. But let's unpack that side of the coin here. And this is, I think, an opportunity to talk about this potential dream team of, Westinghouse AP1000 reactors, built by the Koreans, essentially. So let's unpack that topic.
Yeah. Okay. So let me walk first through the other options. I agree with you on the Russian front. I think they are very taxed right now. Rosatom is in terms of the number of projects they have, and there's further new projects coming, such as in Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. They also, I think, the Rosatom offering of just this full service is not necessarily the one that would get them over the line in Saudi Arabia, right? Like it's great if you're a Bangladesh or an Egypt, but if you don't really care about the financing as much, and your motivation is to build out domestic industry and a sort of a technology base, it's not clear to me that Rosatom is the one you go to for that.
Good point.
China they were obviously very good at building lots of reactors. They've pulled down their costs. They have limited export experience, basically just Pakistan. But those Pakistani reactors, as far as we know, have been very on schedule, have been very cheap. So there's a lot in favor of that. It's not clear how much capacity China has to spare. I think one of the reasons, 10 years ago, Beijing was talking about Belt and Road, and they were trying to get Chinese reactors out into Argentina and Romania and the UK and going all over the place. None of that has happened. And it's not clear to me that the Chinese are very upset about that. They just have so much to do domestically. I don't think they don't need it for the business per se. At some point, they're going to need it. They're going to do it. But it might be Saudi Arabia, might not. I think I'll say not much about the French. I I don't think anyone really is expecting them to win in a competition like this.
Well, they voluntarily withdrawn from so many places as well, right?
The French, yeah, I mean, yes, they they are
Isn't the new
also very
policy?
focused, and they are
Yeah.
also very focused. They have, they're still getting Flamanville 3, this 20-year project, trying to get it up to full commercial operation. They're still slogging away at what is now the most expensive nuclear plant in the world, Hinkley Point C, in the UK, which is 2 EPRs, and then a further 2 EPRs are starting construction as Sizewell C. And they want to build 6 to 14 EPR2s in France. So they have their hands full. Even if there was a huge demand for what they were offering outside of France and the UK, I don't think they're super hard pushing for that. So I think that then narrows us down to Westinghouse and the Koreans and KEPCO in this case. Certainly, when I have talked to people who don't have skin in the game, most people agree probably the most attractive commercial option is the KEPCO offering. It is, I mean, I think I said this in the other episode. It's they did really well at Baraka at the UAE with those 4 reactors. It was their first export project. There were some delays at the end, but that was more standing up an operating company more than anything else. But it was a very successful program. They transferred a lot of knowledge to the UAE, which is something Saudi Arabia would be interested in. And they did it all very professionally. It was a sort of constantly cited as the model export project in the nuclear space right now. So there's a lot of reasons they would be the ones to go to. But can they? And a couple things. One, you have, I'm sure you have things to say about the agreement in January between, it was both KEPCO and KHMP, their subsidiary / competitor that actually operates all the Korean reactors. But they had this long-standing IP dispute with intellectual property dispute with Westinghouse that had this big global settlement in January. Separate to that was a bilateral agreement between Washington and Seoul, which paved the way for this category of intermingled technology, where Seoul did not concede the Westinghouse contention, at least in this agreement, that this was US origin technology, but it was intermingled, and therefore both countries have to sign off in terms of export controls for that technology. Meaning, any Korean supply to Saudi Arabia would need a 123 agreement to be in place.
Okay.
Also meaning, even if that agreement's in place, you still need to get the export controls from the US. So the US has this lever, the US government has this lever of control there. Then, separate from that, there's this commercial agreement between KEPCO and KHMP on one side and Westinghouse on the other side in January, which is the details of which are very not public.
But they're leaking. It does.
They are
When
leaking.
we last talked, yeah.
Yes.
And you know what I'm calling this? You know what I'm calling this,
What
Phil?
are you calling it?
I'm calling it the Westinghouse Monroe Doctrine. Because what is it? Based from what, the leaks, from what I understand, part of the leaks, the Monroe Doctrine part of the leaks are, you can build your reactors basically state of the Western Hemisphere, state of Europe, state of Japan. You can have Czechoslovakia because you already kind of got your feet wet there.
The Czech Republic.
Sorry, Czech Republic, yeah. And then, yes, thank you for the update. and then you owe us some money every time you build these things, right? I think I saw dollar figures, like 175 million in royalties. Yeah,
a lot of the details have leaked because of this change of government in Korea. So this was all agreed at the very end of the Yoon administration. And if we remember Yoon, he's the one who tried to have his own little coup, got very unpopular, was impeached. Is he now in jail? I'm not entirely sure.
All South Korean ex-presidents are in jail. I don't know if they have like a wing for them, but why anyone wants to become the president of South Korea with the track record of like how many of them end up in jail is beyond me. But anyway, carry on.
So this new administration of Lee, um, and the government has been reviewing that deal a lot. And so there has been all of this testimony and leaks to the Korean press. And I think just actually explaining to politicians the details of that deal. And this new administration is deeply unhappy with that deal. I mean, the other thing we've asked a lot, what are the details of this deal to the Koreans and to Westinghouse? They don't want to talk about it. But we've also seen, as you said, in Europe, we have seen other reactor selection processes where KHNP just came and pulled its name out. So Slovenia, Sweden, the Netherlands, Ontario is one
Yeah.
where they had sort of been in talks, and then boom, nope, they were no longer. And so, was that written down as part of the agreement with Westinghouse? Probably not, because there would be antitrust concerns. But was it the impact? Was it the sort of what happened after? Yes. So then going back to Saudi Arabia, did that deal, was there any informal or formal agreement in your Westinghouse Monroe Doctrine regarding Saudi Arabia? Who knows? Maybe not, because maybe they didn't need it, because they still have this lever with Saudi Arabia that
with the 123 agreement,
right? Or they can just
and export control.
Export control. And they could potentially they needed a 123 agreement if they are going to supply reactors. So both sides would need a 123 agreement, and both sides would need the export controls. Would Washington, if in a world where the 123 agreement goes forward without exclusivity on the commercial front, so without being paired with an actual Westinghouse deal to supply reactors, so in a world where Riyadh gets a 123 agreement and then says, actually, we're going to go with the Koreans. Sorry, we're going to build those APR 1400s.
Right.
What would Washington do? Who knows?
What could they do? They could say no?
Well, they might not want to give the export controls, right?
Exactly. So they have a mechanism by which to say
They have a mechanism by which to do that. But also,
it'd be extreme to use.
It would be very, very extreme.
So you have the big stick, but you walk softly and just kind of drag the stick behind you. Maybe lift it up once in a
while. Certainly, Westinghouse would prefer that all of these theatrics in the White House result in them just sort of knocking out the competition altogether, coming in. And I think on top of, you've done a whole podcast on this other very vague 80 billion US deal to build some number of AP1000s in the US, possibly with some Japanese financing. If any of that becomes real,
just 80 billion, just a little.
There's no way there's all of that is being financed by Japan.
Fair enough.
Or even most of that. But point being, if that becomes real, and we also have even more real than that is 3 AP1000s in Poland, potentially 2 more in Bulgaria. Does Westinghouse have the capacity? We talked about Rosatom capacity. We talked about Chinese capacity, but Westinghouse. Westinghouse is not. It's not an EPC. It's not a huge supply chain company, right? Like what you are buying with Westinghouse is basically the NSSS design and maybe some limited supply chain, but then that can be mapped onto something else. So you could see a world where Westinghouse is like, yeah, we'd love to do this, cement the US-Saudi relationship, but the big EPC, as you said, and potentially a lot of supply chain. Well, certainly a lot of supply chain. For any AP1000, you're going to get some South Korean supply chain. But they might go big on South Korean supply chain, South Korean scope there just to pull them into something. Similarly, in Bulgaria, so the Westinghouse EPC that they finished up Vogel with was Bechtel. That's who they're paired with in Poland for these 3 AP1000s. Bulgaria, it's not Bechtel, it's Hyundai. And you could see a world where they keep that partnership, and they're also partnered there for potentially trying to get business in the Nordics. You could see that partnership extended to Saudi Arabia with a lot more Korean supply chain. and maybe it works. I don't know.
Okay, riddle me this, Phil, because last I checked, Westinghouse plus Bechtel in Poland, is it like 54 billion USD, and
Yes.
Bulgaria, Westinghouse paired with what is it, Hyundai is like, is it 14? It's something ridiculously low.
It's preposterously low. I don't have the numbers in front of me. It is pretty insane, the disparity between the headline numbers there.
Do you have a read on that? Is that like South Korean EPC competence, bluster, bravado, willingness to take on risk? What's going on there?
I think all of the above. I think the Bulgarian numbers, which are not so. I think where we are with those numbers is they are now reviewing them as the project gets more. So we don't have the final numbers on what that's going to look like. But
Right.
the way KHMP won the new build competition at Dukovany in Czech Republic.
Czech
Sorry, I'm
Republic, yeah.
diverting a tiny bit, but
Yeah.
they basically promised a overnight turnkey contract. They
Yeah.
basically said, "We are taking on all the construction risk. We will build this in whatever period of time and hand you over the keys." And as far as I can tell, this is not confirmed, but as far as I can tell, I think that's a lot what Hyundai is promising here for Westinghouse reactors in Bulgaria. Um, so again, this is not finalized. There is not a signed EPC contract. It is not at the stage of the Czech project. But yes, I think there is this credible appetite in South Korea to win these projects. And part of that is shown through the amount of risk they are able to absorb. I think possibly that all could get, I mean, I think it's too late for Dukovany. Something like this could, well, I get Hyundai is a private company, so they can do what they want to do. But I don't think this new government in South Korea is wild about taking on tons more risk to
Right.
win nuclear export projects when, they'll support them. But I don't think this is not like their favorite industry like it was President Yoon. Or sorry, Prime Minister Yoon.
Yeah, interesting. So, I mean, you can have a kind of ideal situation for Westinghouse where they're, again, the vendor of the technology and a very limited supply chain scope, taking on very, very low risk in terms of construction. And then you get the South Koreans with their big brass balls coming in. And I mean, maybe this is sort of the fantasy world here, but, offering a very attractive, almost sort of turnkey EPC deal on actually getting it built. I mean, it sounds sort of too good to be true, and it sounds like a lot of risk for South Korea potentially to take on. But it certainly does seem like there's a decent probability of things moving this way. There's again the carrots and the big stick or sticks. And it'll just be interesting to see, I guess, how U.S. South Korean relations work out and what kind of art of the deal making happens to maybe nudge the South Koreans into entering some kind of a world like that. But as you mentioned, we're not just talking KHNP and KEPCO, we're talking private EPC companies like Hyundai. It's a crazy world.
Right. So does KEPCO ENC, it's like big construction subsidiary, does that get some business too? Who knows? I mean, another thing, we talked about the sort of non-proliferation stuff, but we now have Saudi Arabia being very public saying it wants a uranium enrichment program, and we have South Korea saying it wants a uranium enrichment program. Um, is that also part of the puzzle? One of the problems there is what is the enrichment technology that the US would offer? The sort of the gold standard now, sorry, that's the wrong word to use. The
Right.
the most commercial uranium enrichment technology right now is Urenco's. And that is a technology, or to be fair, it's their joint venture with Orano, enrichment technology company, ETC. These are the machines manufactured in the Netherlands mainly, that are at all of the Urenco plants and at the Orano plant. And these are the best centrifuges out there. There are there are some US options. There's Centrus, which has its like old sort of inherited this US government program for these enormous centrifuges. It has never been demonstrated that there's a commercial. There's a couple startups out there, including General Matter, this sort of Peter Thiel startup that is talking probably centrifuges. They're very mysterious about it. So there are possibilities out there, but the US government cannot offer South Korea or Saudi Arabia Urenco machines. So if it does want to sort of seal the deal by saying, "Oh, we will let you, sorry, we will in our 1, 2, 3 agreement not insist that you force fire enrichment, and we'll even help you out with enrichment," they have limited tools there to actually offer something that is commercial.
Wow. Wow. There's a lot of moving parts here. Um, I guess like if Saudi Arabia does elect to deploy in the Bulgarian model AP-1000s with some sort of South Korean entity providing EPC. Does this mean like the death of the APR-1400? That's a lot of investment that Korea's put into building this reactor at home, standardizing it for export, getting it out to the UAE. There's, I think, I guess the problem with South Korean politics is they tend to swing from pro-nuclear to anti-nuclear to lukewarm nuclear governments. But yeah, would this be a massive sort of sacrifice of investment on the APR 1400 if things were to move in this direction? Is it inevitable because of this situation with IP and Westinghouse and export controls?
I don't think so. I mean, I think so. Uh, I'm just going through the world map in my head. They are building more of them in South Korea.
Okay,
Probably not as many as the previous government would have wanted, but like there are projects going forward, APR 1400s going forward in South Korea. They are building a slightly downscaled version of them in the Czech Republic, 2 of
right.
them. And they are, I think, still, they have not withdrawn from Turkey, which is talking about its second and third big 4-reactor units. Its first plant is supplied by Rosatom. So they are in the running there. I don't think whatever was agreed in January with Westinghouse knocks them out of the race in Turkey, where Westinghouse is not trying to move in, at least with large reactors, possibly SMRs. So, um, so just that, there's a bunch there. I think there's a couple other jurisdictions where the Koreans are still trying to supply large reactors, but my very long-term analysis is I think it's very hard for a reactor vendor to have a really vibrant export business when its domestic market dries up.
Mm.
And or when there's just this back and forth, yes, no in the domestic market. I think one of the reasons a lot of the Japanese vendors, which tried really hard post Fukushima in the teens, in the 20 teens, um, s- they tried very hard to stand up export projects in Vietnam and the UK and a couple other places, Lithuania briefly. Um, is when it's dried up at home, when you're not allowed to build these things at home, it's very hard to make the pitch to another locality. Oh yeah, well they don't like them at home. They don't think they're safe there, but we're happy to supply them here. We saw the same thing with Germany, right? Like when in the decades ago when they first announced their phase out, like we saw Siemens and Kraftwerk and everyone, it just didn't make any sense, and the business disappears. So I think there's this fundamental limiting factor for Korean nuclear industry. I think the current government is not quite as anti-nuclear as the before Yoon. There was Moon, who was very anti-nuclear. But I do think long term there is a fundamental challenge there.
We've touched on a lot of bases. I think we've sort of brought a lot of nuance into the Saudi deal here. But I guess maybe thematically, it'd be interesting to close. I think as we've started to illustrate on just how complex technology selection processes are for new entrant countries, really for any country that's buying a nuclear power plant. How geopolitical this is, with the significance as we've stressed of 60, 80, 100-year deals between countries really tying in to fuel services agreements that go on for a very long time. And I thought it might be interesting to maybe just bring in the UAE example where there's sweeteners that often go into these deals, and one of the ones I heard about in the UAE was a kind of secret defense pact that obliged Korea to provide some sort of military assistance to the UAE if they faced a crisis, where special units forces from Republic of Korea were stationed in the UAE. I mean, it sounds kind of marginal to have like a UAE special ops team there, like that's the real deal sweetener, but certainly. there was a deal signed between the U.S. and India, which didn't culminate in any reactors getting built, but that opened up the path to a lot of, I think, aviation transfer, not F-35s or anything like that, less sexy jets, but just maybe to comment on again how these deals are sweetened, and I think we've talked a little bit, and this will help just flesh out ultimately how these deals are made in the end, why certain technologies are chosen. But maybe we could just, for this last little section, just zoom out thematically on that topic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know specifically about the security guarantee, but for sure these deals, or look at Russia, Turkey, there's often this is one big component. Arms sales or big jets and stuff are often another. I mean, these are just huge. They become huge parts of the bilateral relationship, and they are weighted alongside these other considerations. There is this tendency to overweight the technical competition,
Right.
and to neglect thinking about the broader geopolitical considerations and the broader geostrategic considerations. And I think that's basically what we've seen in Saudi Arabia, where they did have this very, very robust technology selection process that basically halted several years ago.
Right.
Partially because you just can't do those processes alone. You can, but you rarely can complete them alone, because then they'll ultimately, for deals this big and this important and this long term, they have to go to the top level, and the top level has to say yes. And the top level is not just thinking about what is the cheapest LCOE and the
Yes.
best supply chain for this random reactor. They are thinking about relationships and very long-term geopolitics. So yeah, I think it's very important to highlight that. It's hard as a reporter to get that, particularly if we're talking about secret security deals. I'm not in the room to hear those stuff, but that stuff.
Well, I think that's a fantastic place to leave it, and this conversation became even more in depth. And what am I trying to say? Like I'm struggling for words right now, but we brought in a lot here, Phil, and for me anyway, this was really entertaining. I think like a big takeaway for me, I guess, with taking a step back as a kind of energy cultural warrior, and being a little more data driven these days, is just how much solar Saudi Arabia is going to be installing over the next decade. And again, I always talk about nuclear as a need to have, not a nice to have technology. There's, I guess, some exceptions to the rule in terms of national prestige projects or high technology, or having breakout for a potential weapons program. But yeah, there's a lot of solar, a lot of gas in Saudi Arabia. They don't really need 20 gigawatts of nuclear to sort of green the deserts and desal. So interesting. We'll see what happens here, and we'll be watching the space carefully. And just as we checked in, maybe 6-7 months later after our Westinghouse of Pain episode, now we've got our Westinghouse Monroe Doctrine episode. I don't know what we'll call it.
I'm sure Westinghouse is going to love your neologism there.
All right, Phil. Thanks for coming back on.
Thanks. It's always a pleasure.
Today's episode was made possible through a generous donation from the Xerxes Foundation and from listeners like you making pledges on our Substack. If you'd like to join the tribe, please do head over to our Substack, smash that pledge button, or if you would like a tax-deductible receipt, you can hit the donate button and make a contribution through our fiscal sponsor. We genuinely appreciate your support. It is only through your generosity that we are able to continue to offer energy literacy on demand.